Mr. Wiley,
Yes.
why did you keep your daughter in a room?
Mr. Wiley has no comment.
No comment.
We haven't had time to discuss the charges. We haven't even seen them.
In an unassuming city in southwestern California, a well-kept, albeit terrible secret was being held in the Wiley home. In 1957, Clark and Dorothy Wiley welcomed their fourth and final child, Genie. Clark had worked as a flight mechanic during World War II, and his wife, who was 20 years younger, fled from Oklahoma to Southern California with her family during the Dust Bowl. As a child, Dorothy suffered long-term neurological damage after an incident which had caused degenerative vision problems in one of her eyes. Clark, as a child, grew up in orphanages in the Pacific Northwest due to his father dying after being struck by lightning. His mother, who rarely spent time with Clark, ran a brothel. It's mentioned that his mother had given him a feminine name, which, as you can imagine during this time, led to lots of bullying in his early years. Due to this, he began to resent his mother, and it may have been the foundation of his anger issues. Genie's father utterly despised children and never wanted any of his own, despite having 4 with Dorothy. Roughly 5 years into their marriage, Dorothy became pregnant with their first child. Clark had repeatedly beat her during pregnancy and even attempted to strangle her to death near the end of her term. Afterwards, while in the hospital from her injuries, she gave birth to what seemed like a healthy daughter. This abusive man, known as Clark, found the child's crying disturbing, so in order to separate himself from the child's cries, he placed her in the garage. The infant then caught pneumonia and passed away at the young age of 10 weeks. You'd think he would do something to avoid having children, but as mentioned earlier, Genie was the 4th child. Their second child, who was born approximately 1 year later, passed away at only 2 days of age due to an Rh incompatibility. Their third child and second son was seen as healthy despite having the same Rh incompatibility. Due to Clark forcing Dorothy to keep him quiet, this caused significant psychological and linguistic developmental delays. After turning 4, his grandmother was concerned for his development and took over caring for him, and made great progress with his development, but was eventually returned to his parents. Not much is known about Genie's early life, but overall, she had pretty good health and had no worrying developmental issues. She was noted to appear malnourished at 11 months, and at 14 months, she came down with a bad fever and pneumonia. It was at this point speculation from a pediatrician who saw her, stating she may be, fitting in the time period, mentally retarded. Due to this mention, this furthered Clark's belief that Genie was severely mentally disabled. At 20 months, her paternal grandmother had perished due to a hit and run. During the grieving process, her father had shifted blame onto his son, as he was walking with her at the time, and after the driver was only given a probationary sentence, Clark had lost any ounce of hope he had for humanity. Due to his beliefs about Genie's mental state, he strongly believed that she needed him to care for her and protect her from the outside world, unknowingly causing more harm than good. After the lost faith in humanity, he took it upon himself to shield her from the outside world, so he quit his job, moved their family into his mother's 2-bedroom house, and demanded her car and bedroom be untouched, apparently as a shrine to his mother, further isolating the family as a whole. After the move, Clark steadily increased Genie's isolation in the second bedroom in the back of the house, while the rest of the family slept in the living room. Every day, for about 13 hours a day, he tied her to a child's toilet seat in a makeshift harness that he forced Dorothy to make. This harness was meant to act as a straitjacket and only allowed Genie to move her extremities. While in the harness, she wore only a diaper and again was kept there for 13 hours. At nighttime, Clark would tie her into a sleeping bag and place her into a crib with a makeshift metal screen cover. She was entirely immobilized. It is believed that she was sometimes kept in her harness overnight, hanging above the toilet until the following night when Clark remembered to pull her down and put her to bed. When the family had first moved in, she was allowed some time outside. But after breaking out of the playpen, her father grew increasingly angry and decided to not let her outside of the house at all. Things grew so abusive, if it wasn't already, that whenever Genie made any sound or vocalized at all, her father would beat her with a large wooden plank that was kept in her room for that exact purpose. It wasn't hypothesized until later on, but he would also snarl at her like a dog and bare his teeth to keep her quiet as well, instilling fear in her similar to a frightened animal. Later on, it was assumed Clark had done this due to seeing himself as a guard dog and literally acting out the role. These noises would occur outside the door if he ever suspected her of doing something he did not like or approve of, despite being physically unable. This weirdo grew out his nails so he could scratch at her as well. Due to these bursts of anger, she learned to make as little noise as possible and never provided any outward expression. Genie had also developed a very odd tendency of masturbating in socially inappropriate contexts, which led researchers and doctors to consider this to be the cause of sexual abuse by her father and or forced sexual abuse from her brother by Clark. Although it's just speculation, there is no definitive outright spoken answer for this behavior Genie had developed. While held captive, she was only fed baby food, cereal, an occasional soft-boiled egg, and plenty of liquid. During feeding, her brother, who was often coerced, would stuff her mouth full of food, and if she choked or didn't swallow fast enough, her face would be forcefully put into the food, rubbing her face in it. Clark mentioned he had fed her 3 times a day, but due to beatings if she made noises when hungry, it's believed she may have went days without eating at a time. Dorothy, around 11 p.m., would sometimes sneak into her room to feed her, all while trying not to get caught. This was the only time her mother was allowed to see her. Clark also had a very low tolerance for noise, so much so that he refused to have a working television or radio in the house. Whether this was to shelter Genie even further, or if the low tolerance was true, is up to speculation. He would often beat Dorothy and his son if their conversation was too loud or they spoke without permission, and all conversations were done far from earshot, preventing Genie from ever hearing any meaningful amount of language. Her room was kept completely dark, and the only stimuli provided was the crib, the toilet, curtains, pieces of furniture, and raincoats. He rarely allowed her to play with plastic eating containers, spools of thread, and TV guides, with many, if not all, the illustrations cut out. The only outside stimulus she experienced was the slightly open window that allowed her to see the side of another house and a sliver of the sky. She occasionally heard environmental sounds and the oddly juxtaposed child next door practicing piano. Nobody was ever allowed to leave the house, only allowing Genie's brother to go to and away from school, and required him to prove his identity before entering his own home. To discourage disobedience, he would constantly sit in the living room with a shotgun on his lap. Allegedly, nobody in the neighborhood was aware of the abuse taking place, and some say they didn't even know they had a child aside from Genie's brother. Throughout the abuse, Clark had kept detailed notes describing the mistreatment and the efforts he went to conceal it. Dorothy was completely blind at this point and was constantly beaten, and her life even threatened if she were to contact anyone outside of the house for assistance. The brother was also abused constantly, with each beating growing more and more severe, and even forcing him to abuse Genie as well. Clark was convinced that Genie would not live past the age of 12, and promised Dorothy that if she did survive, he would allow her to seek assistance for Genie. Once she turned 12, he pulled back on that promise. In October of 1970, Genie was 13 years old. Her parents had a very violent argument, which had caused Dorothy to take Genie and leave the house while Clark was out. Her brother had already left the house around age 18 and was living with friends. Dorothy decided to apply for disability benefits due to her blindness. But, due to her blindness, she accidentally entered the General Social Services office. The employees had thankfully taken note that something was wrong after looking at Genie, and contacted the police. The parents were arrested, and Genie had become a ward of the court. This means she had been placed under the protection of a legal guardian or government body. Upon tests and observations, Genie was extremely malnourished and pale. She had nearly 2 full sets of teeth, and her abdomen was hugely expanded. Due to the harness she was forced into every day, this had caused a very thick callus on her bottom area with heavy black bruising. Despite having normal vision in both eyes, she was unable to focus on anything for more than 10 feet or 3 meters away, which was an effect of being confined in her bedroom. Her structure in walking was coined as the bunny walk due to Genie not being able to fully straighten her limbs and held her hands in front of her in a claw-like fashion. Genie also didn't have the ability to swallow due to her dysphagia, and in order to combat this, she would hold anything she couldn't swallow in her mouth until her saliva broke it down. If the food did not break down, she would spit it out and mash it with her fingers. Afterwards, Genie had gone into a few different foster homes and made a lot of progress. But there is sadly only so much that can be done after all the damage that was done to her body and her brain. When she turned 18, her mother sought to care for her, but after a short time, she deemed it too difficult and distressing, so she decided to send her to a foster home. After much progress, her next home only caused her to backtrack on that progress due to her throwing up and being emotionally and physically abused for it. She resorted back to silence as her coping mechanism and was afraid of eating or speaking for the threat of her not being able to see her mother again if she threw up on the floor one more time. She was eventually removed from the home and placed in another. Although doing better at this one, she continued down the cycle of the arrangement ending and a new one starting. As of 2016, she is living in an undisclosed facility in Los Angeles. After a private investigator was hired by someone who wanted to remain anonymous, it was stated that she seemed very happy, and although only spoke a few words, she mainly communicated through sign language. Dorothy was reported to have died in 2003, and her brother in 2011. As for Clark, after Genie's situation was discovered and made headlines, he refused to speak to police and stated the constant barrage of people trying to see him was unbearable. On November 20th, 1970, the morning before a scheduled court appearance on child abuse charges, Clark had committed suicide by gunshot. he had left behind 2 suicide notes. One to his son, "Be a good boy. I love you." And one directed to the police. "The world will never understand." It's no secret that this is one of the most severe instances of child abuse and neglect, and upon researching, I had no idea the extent of what living was like in that household until now.
Why did you keep your daughter in a room?
Mr. Wiley has no comment.
No comment.
We haven't had time to discuss the charges. We haven't even seen them.
Genie's parents were both charged with willful abuse. 15 minutes before he was due in court, her father put a gun to his head